and we've studied this a little bit, but I want to get into more depth, and I especially want to talk about some types of conflict that you may not have heard of before, and because there's some really important stuff that I think that you have not covered in the past, and that the rest of the class actually is not going to learn about. But I think that you are at a point where you're able to comprehend that. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the more common kinds of conflict, and then I'm going to talk about some kinds of conflict that are a little more in depth and more complicated. So you can see this picture of Mrs. Quigley and me getting ready to fight it out in conflict. Now, this would be a perfect example of what would be called character versus. It's confusing because different texts call conflict different things. You have man versus man, which is what this would be, Mrs. Quigley versus me. You have character versus character, and you have, or the same thing, you could actually have person versus person. I tend to use man versus man, man versus self, in other words, because that's how you oftentimes see it referred to. It's a little sexist to say man versus man, but unfortunately that's the way it's often referred to. So you can use man versus man, character versus character, person versus person interchangeably. They kind of mean the same thing. So let's talk about conflict first. Conflict is an element of story that makes that story exciting. You just, even the worst Hallmark movie, even the worst, cheesiest kind of Christmas story that you see, where, and I've seen a lot of them lately, living at home, there is conflict. There is this idea that you have two opposing forces kind of going at it. And if you didn't have conflict, it would be a really boring story. And what happens is this conflict builds and builds and builds until we have what's called the climax, which we've read about already or talked about already. And it's where that conflict is decided. There's usually, for lack of better terms, there's a winner and a loser. So conflict can be defined as a struggle between two or more opposing forces within the text. There's these two sides that are, for lack of a better word, they're fighting it out. And that doesn't mean they're literally punching each other, but there is a battle of the wills. There is this conflict, this big quote-unquote argument that's going on between the two of them. So let's talk about the different kinds. Now I'm going to go through quickly these because you have demonstrated some mastery on these main kinds. So first of all, man versus man. Man versus man is very simply, it's the conflict in this text is where the characters, they're usually human, although sometimes it could be personification, and you can have animals or something battling up. But usually this is where two people or groups of people battle it out. They have different positions, different points of view, and they are going at it, and they are fighting it out. So a blubber is a classic example of young adult literature that is human versus human. This is where there are bullies and there is a victim, okay? Think about action movies. Most action movies are man versus man or human versus human. James Bond movies, think about that. Any of the Mission Impossible movies, you have well-defined good guys and bad guys. And that is certainly what would be man versus man. One thing to note, that sometimes people think if they see a fight in the story, that makes it automatically man versus man. Well, not necessarily. Just because two people in the story get into some sort of disagreement or fight, that does not mean the overall conflict of the book is man versus man. You have to look at the text as a whole. Overall, biggest and most prevalent one has to be the kind of conflict that goes through the entire book. And then, of course, I have my little example there. I have Pity the Fool. I don't know if any of you guys know Mr. T, the African-American guy. And, of course, Rocky Balboa. Perfect example of man versus man. Okay, moving on. Man versus nature. Easy one to spot. This is where the character is battling out, for lack of better words, he or she is battling out with Mother Nature. Lost in a snowstorm. Stranded on an island. These are all examples of where the character is battling the elements of nature to stay alive. These are usually really easy to spot. The book Hatchet, many Gary Paulson books, usually involve this type of conflict where you have a character who is trying to stay alive through very, very difficult circumstances brought upon by Mother Nature. Into Thin Air is a great book and movie that is an example of man versus nature. Certainly the show Man vs. Wild, I don't know if you've ever seen it, is even though it's a stage show and obviously no one's going to die in the show, it's man versus nature. There are plenty of great movies, actually, that are man versus nature. Castaway, the Tom Hanks movie with Wilson, the volleyball. Everest, about this terrible trip to the top of Mount Everest, and All Is Lost. I would recommend that movie to a lot of you. It's some people might find it slow, but there's a man alone on a sailboat, and he ends up getting a leak, and in the leak, the sailboat is slowly sinking, and it takes him days to kind of try and figure out how he's going to stay alive with this boat that's totally disabled. It's a very great story. And this is my poster, Into the Wild. It's a great movie, as well as it was a book at first. This young boy goes into the wilderness and tries to stay alive, and he kind of comes across this abandoned bus. So he tries to stay alive up there. That's Man versus Nature. Man versus Self. This is not an example of someone trying to punch themselves in the face, but this is where a character is struggling with himself or herself, trying to make a decision, trying to decide how to act. It's always, this conflict is in a character's mind. This is sometimes one of the most difficult ones to spot, but it's the most fascinating, I think. In my opinion, Man versus Self, or character versus self, is the most entertaining kind, because you're struggling, the character's struggling to make a decision about how to act, what's doing. Usually it's a question of doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, and what are the benefits and the consequences of either. So an example of this is, pretend you cheated on a test and you feel terrible about it. Do you tell the teacher the truth and get in trouble, or do you just live with the guilt and take the good grade? And if you struggle with that decision, then it's Man versus Self. My favorite example is something you're going to probably read in high school, called Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. The bottom line is this guy kills someone, and he takes the person's heart, and he buries the whole person beneath the house. And what's great is he keeps hearing the guy he killed. He keeps hearing the heartbeat. Now, he doesn't really hear it. Obviously, the guy's dead, but it's in his mind. He's so racked with guilt about doing this that he thinks he's hearing this heart beating. And that's a perfect example of Man versus Self, because he is at war with himself about this, about his decision to do this. Next, Man versus Society. Man versus Society is this kind of conflict you probably haven't studied in the past, but I want to spend some time talking about it. In this type of conflict, the character is fighting some larger, bigger group that is usually in a position of authority. So for instance, if you're fighting some school, or let's say, for instance, that you think the dress code at Brady is terrible. You think you should be able to wear whatever you want all the time. And you make all these, let's say you go to student council meetings, you go to board meetings, and you talk about what needs to change in order to be able to get what you want, which is to wear different kinds of clothes, what you want to wear at any given time. Well, that's Man versus Society. You are fighting this bigger entity. In this case, it's the school, because when you get to school, whether you like it or not, you have to follow certain rules. And if you don't, you get into trouble. That's Man versus Society. If you look at some of the controversy surrounding police shootings and so forth, a lot of people are doing what they would consider Man versus Society. They're fighting this bigger structure. In this case, it would be the government or the police department. That would all be considered Man versus Society. Great example is in the Hunger Games. It's an easy one to point out. And I know I use this as an example a lot, but it's relevant. You could say a lot of times Katniss is out there fighting nature because fires and tracker jackers and all that stuff. But why is she in that position in the first place? Well, the government put her there. And everyone, as you know, in the Hunger Games doesn't like living in this government that people have no freedom at all. You do what the government says to do. And that is a perfect, and she's fighting this, and so are some of the other people that are on her side. This is a perfect example of Human versus Society, or Man versus Society. And there's a lot of this in the real world. If you go to some countries, you are not allowed to criticize the government. You are not allowed, if you're a woman in some countries, you're not allowed to drive a car. And if you want to do that and you want to fight those things, that is a perfect example of Man versus Society. Now, I wanted to say something really important. There's usually more than one type of conflict in a book. There's a lot of different ones. In the book we're reading right now, all of these, you can find at least four of these, three of the four types of conflict in here. So I just want to make that point. You would definitely have different kinds of conflict. However, there is usually one overarching type of conflict that is the biggest part, and you might not know that until the very end of the book. So I just want to make that clear. Yeah, there's my boy. He's Man versus Food, which I think is the disgusting show. And no, that's not a major type of conflict. Okay. Here are the extension ones. Here is some ones that are a little bit different. This is what's called person versus God or man versus God. Okay, what does that mean? If the character or characters feel like they are, quote unquote, fighting God or some higher power, that is person versus God or character versus God or man versus God. So what does that mean? That means that the protagonist is at war, if you want to, for lack of better words, against this bigger power. And great example of this would be a myth called the Odyssey. And I don't know if any of you have heard this or read of this, but the idea is the main character thinks he is able to defeat. He cannot be affected by the gods. And of course, you know, in Greek and Roman mythology, they didn't have one god. They believed in multiple gods. Well, you can see in this picture here, you have Poseidon, who's the king of the sea, or the god of the sea, trying to show Odysseus, the main character, who is boss. And in this wonderful story, it is truly a situation where Odysseus is trying to stay alive despite Poseidon's best efforts to make his life miserable. There's other examples. If in terms of tragedy, if a person is very sick, let's say with cancer, and he or she is blaming God, whether you agree or not with that kind of mindset, it is still be considered man versus God because that character has framed it in that way. Okay? You'll love this one. Person versus supernatural. This is where the person is battling something they can't explain. Now, you could say it's a little bit like the god or gods, but it's not, because it really fits into its own little category. And it's usually this sense of evil. If you think about ghost stories, if you think about vampire stories where the character is at odds or battling this kind of supernatural force, this thing that can't be explained and usually is evil. That's the word malevolent here. Malevolent means evil. That is a good example of man versus the supernatural. And if you look here, I love this. This is a great movie, although you shouldn't watch it because it's rated R, but it's a wonderful movie called The Blair Witch Project. And these campers go into the wilderness, and there's all these crazy things that happen caused by witches. Supernatural, ghosts, vampires, extraterrestrials, all examples of supernatural forces at work. And then finally, and this is going to become more and more prevalent, this idea of person versus or man versus technology. Technology is everywhere now. And think about the last time something in your life regarding technology didn't work. So a computer didn't work the right way, or your iPod or iPhone or something with technology didn't work. That's just a small example, but imagine if eventually we end up being if technology takes over our world. There's some really great books that are coming out about this. One book called Feed, about these kids who have, all the students have microchips implanted into their brains. And they get this constant feed, so that's where the title comes from, of information. And so when you have people fighting technology from kind of taking over, that is a great example of person versus technology. This is a scene from the movie The Terminator. Obviously, there was this really bad robot that comes back and is fighting it out. So that's a great example of human versus technology. So I hope I gave you some clarity about this. Lot to think about. You have this copy of your notes, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me, because it's a lot to remember.